Your Eminence, Your Grace. Are we live, Father Ignatius? Your Eminence, Your Grace, fathers and seminarians, friends, and those who are with us via our live stream, glory to Jesus Christ. Since my first moment at St. Tikhon's for my interview, almost precisely, but not quite yet, 3 years ago right now, I have been myself quite moved by St. Nikolai Velimirovich ever since I walked by a small commemoration of his life and ministry here at St. Tikhon's in the faculty hallway. And for the last 3 years, it's been part of my sincere joy and effort to try to honor St. Nikolai as I grow to know and love him largely through my experience here at St. Tikhon's by the establishment of the shrine in his cell where he prayed and where he wrote. I learned at supper mostly by night. If I'm not stealing your words, Your Grace, he said, the day belongs to everyone else, but the night belongs to me, and he wrote by night. To establish a shrine in that beautiful and sacred space on which we're working diligently, and likewise to establish in his honor, in a parallel to our St. Tikhon's lecture in the fall, a St. Nikolai lecture in the spring. Last year, by God's providence, not necessarily understandable by us all, or maybe by any, among the very last things that we did was cancel the St. Nikolai lecture, along with church, school, and life for the most part, as we began our immersion in this year of COVID. But also by God's providence, we have begun sincerely in earnest tonight on this great occasion, what I hope will be the first annual St. Nikolai lecture in honor of our canonized rector. And it's a great honor for us to welcome His Grace Bishop Irenei, who, I will leave the words to him, but has known him since before he was born, it turns out. And so I'd like to introduce His Grace briefly and then yield the rest of the evening to him to share with you beautiful words based on all kinds of interviews that he himself did, especially with those people who definitely knew St. Nikolai, though His Grace was 1 year old when St. Nikolai reposed. It's our pleasure to welcome tonight as our guest speaker His Grace Irenei, Bishop of the Eastern American Diocese of the Serbian Orthodox Church, born in Cleveland, Ohio, and I also understand longtime friends with Mickey Herzak, the chairman of our board, who sends his greetings to you. His Grace is a son of St. Tikhon's, being in 1979 summa cum laude graduate of the seminary. His Grace went to St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary in Crestwood, New York, and graduated in 1982 with a Master's in Divinity degree, with honorable mention for his master's thesis, Bishop Nikolai Velimirovich, a 1921 mission to America. His Grace has lectured at Loyola University in Chicago, as well as the theological faculty of the Serbian Orthodox Church in Belgrade. For many years, he was the co-editor of The Path of Orthodoxy, the official publication of the Serbian Orthodox Church in the United States and Canada. Ordained to the priesthood in 1995 and consecrated to the dignity of bishop in 2006, on May 25, 2016, the Holy Assembly of Bishops of the Serbian Orthodox Church elected by acclamation Bishop Irenei of Australia and New Zealand to the throne of bishops of Eastern America. His Grace holds many appointments to boards and committees of institutions, both within the Church and beyond. His Grace has been bestowed numerous honors for his diplomatic efforts, improving the Serbian Church and state relations, and has also overseen the monumental task of overseeing the rebuilding efforts of the St. Sava Pro-Cathedral in Manhattan, which was destroyed by fire in 2016. It's our pleasure to welcome His Grace back to his alma mater to present the inaugural St. Nikolai lecture, The title of His Grace's talk this evening is St. Nikolai, the Last Years. We also offer our thanks this evening to the Elsie Skvir-Ganister Foundation, which, beginning in October, has helped to make not only our October lecture series, but also this evening's lecture possible, especially for those who are watching with us online. Your Grace, welcome back to St. Tikhon's. Please come and enrich us with beautiful words about St. Nikolai.
Thank you, Father John, for your very kind and overly generous introduction of my humble self. Most Reverend Archbishop Michael, distinguished rector of St. Tikhon's Orthodox Theological Seminary and beloved brother in Christ. Very Reverend Father Dean John Parker, very Reverend and venerable fathers, distinguished professors, staff, and students at St. Tikhon's Orthodox Theological Seminary, honorable ladies and gentlemen, members of our viewing audience, brothers and sisters in Christ all. It is indeed my distinct honor, pleasure, and privileged joy to be able to greet you on this evening for this inaugural address of what is to become, with God's help and by your holy prayers, a series of lectures in honor of Bishop Nikolai Velimirovich, who was the rector of this seminary and who passed away in this very building. It is something of a marvel to me that you have chosen this year, and I would actually dare to say it is not by your choice at all that you have chosen this year in which to inaugurate this lecture series on Bishop Nikolai. Everything under the sun has its purpose, as is deigned by God Himself. This year presents a number of very unique juxtapositions which bring together the Serbian Orthodox Church in the United States of America and Canada, if not in its entirety, and St. Tikhon's Orthodox Theological Seminary. On the one hand, we have the 100th anniversary of the founding of the first Serbian Orthodox diocese in the United States of America and Canada in 1921 at the hands of no less than Bishop Nikolai Velimirovich during his second missionary trip to the United States of America. It is the 140th anniversary year of the birth of our founding bishop and your rector, who was born on the 5th of January, 1881. It is the 65th anniversary of the repose of our founding bishop and first administrator and your rector, March 18th, 1956, and the 30th year of the translation of his relics from St. Sava, Serbian Orthodox Monastery in Libertyville, Illinois, to Lelić in Serbia, the village in which Bishop Nikolai was born and where he erected a church in honor of his parents, and therein his relics repose to this day. I will attempt to address this evening, and I pray that this will be the result of a lifelong fascination and yearning to garner as much as is possible from the life and the works of this truly remarkable Renaissance individual, Nikolai, Bishop of Ohrida and Žiča, who once aptly described himself as a bishop whose diocese knows no borders. And in fact, my very reason for entertaining studies here at St. Tikhon's Orthodox Theological Seminary is precisely because this is where he taught and this is where he reposed in the Lord. And I wanted to come and to be here and to learn as much as I could about the life and the person of Bishop Nikolai. I will endeavor this evening, from my research from those years, to allow this lecture to be a forum for his students, his disciples, his friends and acquaintances to speak experientially of their bishop, professor, mentor, man of prayer, and indeed, friend. Therefore, my approach to this evening's lecture will be teleological. It is greatly inspired, I must say, by the writings of Paweł Florensky. This will allow you, in this limited time span which we have, to come to know the person of Bishop Nicolai and to comprehend the purpose of his life as opposed to causes that arise from his life. That is to say, to speak of the man and not merely about the man. In fact, this approach comes from Bishop Nicolai's understanding of the parables of Jesus Christ. He always tells us, be careful when you go through Scripture to be certain to pay attention not only to the words, but to the order of words. And so often when we hear the story of there was a man who was a king, there was a man who was the head of a household, always man first and position thereafter. Therefore, there is, and not, Bishop Nicolai is a man, is a bishop, is a rector, is a teacher, and not was a man, was a bishop, was a rector, was a teacher. This understanding of the human person I have taken from the writings of the late Archbishop Stylianos of Australia, when he said there is no greater insult when you sing to someone memory eternal and you say he or she was. They still are. However, now in the kingdom of heaven. And therefore, as long as we sing memory eternal, they live because they are alive in God's memory. It was the 18th of March in the year 1956, an early Sunday morning, when the telephone rang in the monastic dormitory. The phone was picked up by Father Vasily Filipov, and on the other end of the phone was Bishop Dionysia of the Serbian Orthodox Church. He asked Father Vasily, could I please speak with Bishop Nicolai? Father Vasily told him, I'm sorry, Your Grace, but that's going to be rather difficult because this is now the time of the year when he resides not in the monastic dormitories, but in the dormitories of the seminary because he simply cannot walk that distance on a daily basis. There are no students to call upon because the students have gone out to a missionary trip in order to earn money, desperately needed funds for the seminary. He said, perhaps it would be good if I went down and got the bishop up for you if he's not already up, and then he could call you back. He said, no, I will wait. You will go and you will call him. And so he left the bishop on the phone, came down to Bishop Nicolai's room, which is here in this building, knocked on the door. There was no answer. After several attempts to rouse him from sleep, which is what he thought, he opened the door and found Bishop Nicolai reposed, lying on the floor with a severe bruise on his head. It appears that he bumped his head when he fell. A tipped-over tea saucer and cup, and a sugar bowl with the sugar spilt on the floor next to him. Thus ended the earthly life of Bishop Nicolai here in this seminary. Sometimes a man dies, writes Professor Veselin Kesic, who was a student and a friend of Bishop Nicolai's, and the life he lived contributed so much to everyone within his sphere of influence that the total loss of the man cannot be estimated, nor ever again be made up. Such a loss to the Orthodox world was the passing of Bishop Nicolai, the Serbian bishop who was the dean of St. Tikhon's Seminary in South Canaan, Pennsylvania, on March 17th, 18th, 1956. Bishop Nicolai's inspiring life in the gentle solitude of South Canaan, Pennsylvania, passed into eternity. These last years were extremely productive for the great bishop in his well-harvested literary field. It is in these final, shall we say, golden years of his earthly life that he produced such fine literary style and profound insight into both humankind and himself. Through works such as The Mystery of Touch, which was the last published work during his life in 1956, we find the summit of his theological development. The Only Lover of Mankind, a second title, which was his last and unfinished work, became a testimony to his keen spiritual vision. Appropriately, this work never ended and instead remains burning forever as a bright spiritual flame that he was to those who knew him, ever illuminating his living memory here at St. Tikhon's Seminary and Monastery. Professor Kesic writes once again, and I must say that I discovered myself in this writing. Bishop Nicolai knew that men are afraid of heights and the depths of thought, and therefore wanted to simplify everything and equalize all things. He fights the reduction of religion to a common denominator. It would be the task of the younger Serbian generation, which has been under the happy influence of Bishop Nicolai's works, to make that part of his writings published only in Serbian a common property of all Orthodox people scattered throughout the Western world. Thus, it can be made available to all those interested in the life and the thought of the Eastern Church. There is an awareness of God's presence. There is a touch of the divine in his work. End quote. Nicolai, while constantly fighting the reduction of religion to a common denominator, maintained, however, that the depths of theology could easily be expressed in terms simple enough for the average person readily to comprehend, and yet never lose sight of their inexhaustible wellspring of knowledge. It was well known that Nikolai Velimirovich was a pioneer in the field of introducing the Anglo-Saxon speaking world to Christian orthodoxy. Never compromising the pleroma of the true Orthodox faith, he would approach other denominations with a great dose of love and understanding, and most important of all, with the greatest example possible, that being himself, the person. All the textbooks and scholarly lectures, which may have been well intended for such express purpose, will never stand in comparison to that of someone who is able to radiate spirituality from within, a living testimony to the fullness of the kingdom of heaven in our very midst. Such a person was Bishop Nicolai. Today, our Holy Orthodox Church is still struggling to earn her deserved recognition in America. She has only to look back at one of her most prominent and energetic forerunners, Nikolai Velimirovich. In a letter dating back to 1946, George Radin, who was a dear friend of the late bishop, wrote to a friend of his, William Chadbourne, to explain what the return of Bishop Nicolai meant to Americans. And he writes, In part, Bishop Nicolai has much to give Christians who gather for religious worship or instruction. Many Americans learned this at first hand during his visits in 1921 and 1927, and I would also add his first missionary trip in 1915. Now, he continues, Bishop Nicolai is here again, enriched by the experience of long suffering. As you know, he has been in Nazi prison camps for more than 4 years. The last of those years, he was kept in a small cell in the ghastly Dachau prison, isolated from the world with the Bible for his sole companionship. Bishop Nicolai's background is scholarly and distinguished. He holds degrees from great institutions of learning, PhD and a doctorate of divinity from the University of Bern in Switzerland, a doctorate of divinity from Oxford University in England, a doctorate of divinity from that great Protestant institution, the University of Glasgow. And he concludes, after much more writing about Bishop Nicolai, with the following. Enriched from his very cradle, Bishop Nicolai is now ready to share his ripe wisdom and his inspiring spiritual qualities with the people of this country. And so it was, indeed, ripe in wisdom and spiritually deepened by the vast experiences of his life, that Bishop Nicolai arrived here to St. Tikhon's Seminary in 1951 to share his vast treasury with its students as one who has seen the glory of his days without the oppression of spiritual pride. Such heights are only achieved through profound experiences of life itself. Bishop Nicolai had 2 priests of the Serbian Orthodox Church who were like sons to him. One of them was a Father Miodrag Đurić, who was the parish priest of our church in Lackawanna, New York. And he wrote the following about Bishop Nicolai. Bishop Nicolai suffered much, internally and externally. When asked why he did not write an autobiography, he humbly replied, "Many ask me the same question, but I don't know what to write about myself, because the milestones I have passed never were outer, but inner, and maybe the people would not understand. All that I have done, I had to do. So now, how could I write about that? I know that my biography will be written by the people with whom I prayed." Although not having known personally in a cognitive manner or prayed with Bishop Nicolai in the flesh, this lecture is indebted to the overwhelming inspiration which has been nurtured in me both through intuition and erudition. When Nicolai came here to St. Tikhon's, he was very well received by both the faculty and the student body alike. A certain John Klimbara, later a priest of the church, wrote an article titled "Faith, Hope, and Charity" in the Russian Orthodox Journal. And he explains well the contemporary sentiments of the students at St. Tikhon's Seminary upon the reception of this Nicolai, who would, in less than a couple of years, find a place in their hearts forever. In the past 2 years, writes John Klimbara, St. Tikhon's Seminary has made 2 very important acquisitions in the realm of education. Bishop Nikolai Velimirovic, Doctorate of Divinity of Serbia, a renowned teacher, author, and theologian, came to the United States 2 years after being miraculously released from the infamous Dachau concentration camp. Despite the suffering he endured during his imprisonment, the venerable bishop once again became active to further the cause of orthodoxy. In his role as a professor of dogmatic theology, moral theology, and homiletics, he won the confidence and love of all of his students. A graduate of Oxford, England, made him a prized addition to the already fine faculty. And truly, beginning in January of 1951, Bishop Nicolai became associated with this seminary, though only as a part-time lecturer in the first half of 1951, where he would divide his time equally between lecturing here at the seminary and living in New York City at the St. Sava Cathedral, which, as mentioned by Father John, was tragically burned down on Pascha of 2016. The small room in which he lived has still survived largely intact, thank God. However, by the fall of 1951, Nicolai had devoted and committed himself as a full-time professor at St. Tikhon's. Whenever his health would permit him, however, he would take the opportunity to travel to New York and to lecture at St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary, then in New York City, and to deliver lectures. His visits were defined by the then students, such as Dr. Veselin Kesic, as being, quote-unquote, most intimate, close, and warm. One of the reasons in particular that he enjoyed so frequently visiting St. Vladimir's was that at the time they had 8 to perhaps 9 Serbian students who had come from abroad following World War II. Father Alexander Schmemann wrote in a letter to me concerning Bishop Nicolai how Bishop Nicolai's visits were received as a great joy for all of us. And he continued by describing the fact that his lectures at the seminary always turned into a long question and answer period. As a professor at St. Tikhon's Seminary, he was a characteristically unusual man. First of all of his courses were profoundly simple, informal, and intimate. His requirements were comparatively meager. The basic format of his classes were the following: he taught, you learned, and he corrected you. Perhaps the most prominent feature of all of his classes was that he taught solely in the English language, the first to have taught here in English and not in Russian, although he was absolutely fluent in Russian and 6 other languages as well, since he studied in Russia itself. At that time, all other courses were in Russian, except for those of visiting professors from local universities and colleges. Father John Klimbara, whom I quoted earlier, noted that perhaps Nicolai's use of the English language was not as much a shock in and of itself as was the fact that how unusual it was to hear someone at that time who wore a mitre and could speak in fluent English. At the time of his residency, Father Klimbara further notes that St. Tikhon's was a nest of Russians in a Dostoevskian haven. So you can imagine the shock waves that the English language sent through the persons who were here studying and teaching. Father Yaroslav Sudik, who during his studies at St. Tikhon's Seminary was a personal secretary to Bishop Nicolai, remembers how thereafter the faculty, which initially received him quite well, several of his colleagues fought with him over the use of the English language. They felt animosity toward the bishop because, in the words of Father Sudik, quote, "Orthodoxy shies away from intellectuality. Nicolai was a bishop of the Orthodox Church and at the same time an international scholar. Orthodoxy still hasn't progressed this far. This is why Nicolai's greater circle of associates were from among the other churches," end quote. Many students recall, however, that if it wasn't for his use of the English language, a good deal of the subtleties of his teachings would have been lost to their memory forever. His English language was superior. Having studied, of course, at Oxford, he spoke very proper British English and had a very extensive and developed vocabulary. Although, most interestingly, Nicolai never felt that he had to prove himself, despite the eloquence of his English language and scholar that he was, his classes, his sermons, his very conversations were always geared toward his audience, and his vocabulary never extended itself beyond the borders of his listeners. He could speak before the royalty of Europe, he could speak before the simplest of peasants, and he knew how to address every one of them and everyone in between on their own level without any sort of reductionism. Most of the students feel that the greatest impression left on them by his teachings, in fact, came from his life itself. He lived his knowledge, and by virtue of his humility, he exuded all of his teachings. Class for Bishop Nicolai was at all times and everywhere, not only in the classroom. Anything which was said to him, he would turn around and develop a greater meaning for it, take examples from conversations, from the dinner table, from simply walking around and talking to others, and introduce examples from the scriptures and relate them to life at hand, forming an acute awareness of what is a living spirituality. As an example, one day in class, Father Joseph Krida, and I saw a stack of his miters in the museum across the way, mentioned that it was such a terrible, dismal day when they were sitting in class, and it was raining, and all the students were complaining. So Nicolai walked over to the window, looked outside, and decided he was going to expound on the further dimensions of rain, beginning with Noah and continuing to their very day. And then he posed a question to the students, what is rain? However, he answered before they could, and he said, it is like Christ, who was also sent by the Father from heaven to water a thirsty earth. That ended the complaints about the dismal nature of that day. Many times the students felt guilty for asking certain questions, never expecting that his responses would be so amazingly deep and genuinely conceived of in a realm which was far beyond their comprehension. Everything mentioned to him was returned in such an absolutely beautiful way, according to the students. Nicolai was known as a man of prayer. When he would enter the classroom, it would seem to light up with some kind of a new life when he entered. He walked in as though he were walking in among the closest of friends. So often it would seem as though he was distanced and in another world, deeply involved in prayer. And as he entered the room, that prayer, which is internal, simply switched on as the microphone is turned on and became an audible prayer. And it was a continuation of the prayer of his heart. At other times, he would walk into the room, greet the students, and then as he greeted the students, he would turn to the icons, greet them, and start talking with the icons. Of all of the icons that they had in the classroom where he taught, his favorite icon was St. George. And every morning, without exception, he would say to St. George, "Good morning, and how are you today?" And to him, whom Nicolai bid a good morning, on a number of occasions, he would continue to ask questions of St. George and at times of the Theotokos. What do you think of this? What do you think of that? Of certain situations that were developing at that time in the life of the seminary. And perhaps that which was the most characteristic feature of Nicolai was that he was a true visionary and could communicate far beyond the average level of anyone's comprehension, even though he always endeavored to make sure everybody would understand everything. That which left the deepest impression on his students, according to them, is the prayerful contact that they came into when they were in touch with Bishop Nicolai. Nicolai's prayers in the classroom were more often than not informal and spontaneous, as basically were his classes also. If for some reason he would decide to begin a class with a traditional prayer such as O Heavenly King, He would always become so emotionally overwhelmed during the prayer that he would lose sight of the continuation of the prayer and simply go on, as someone recorded, "O heavenly King, ah, the wonderful King of heaven, ah, the creator of all. Well, here we are again, beseeching your mercy," and add whatever he felt like adding thereafter. He would always introduce, as mentioned, concerns that came from the welfare of the community or for the welfare of the community, and all of the needs of the community were always introduced into his prayers. Once they had a problem with the water main, and the water was not drinkable because it was a murky brown color. And so Nikolai was praying and looking upward, and at one point he realized that he forgot to mention the water. And so gazing up, he said, in a conversational tone, mind you, "Ah, yes, Lord, I forgot to ask, bless our water." And so the Lord blessed his water. He had a keen sense of humor, which was at times calloused with a touch of sarcasm, and he would often know how to incorporate his own poetics as a didactic employ. When class was in session, Nikolai would sit in a large chair in front of the class and constantly stroke his beard from the underside out and heave out a very deep sigh. If anything unusual would happen, or if he received an incorrect answer from a student, he would respond with, "Oh, my goodness, what is this?" And Nikolai would never allow himself to become angry with his students. However, no one could ever recall that he ever raised his voice at them. He was never disturbed because he was always concerned with only one thing, and that was truth. He would listen to his students with great compassion. If they erred, he did know how to reprimand them, but in such a manner that was stern, however, always backed with a reassuring grin and an answer, "Don't worry." So his students would always feel at ease, even if reprimanded. He would present a correction to them in such a manner that no one was ever offended, because he always radiated with great compassion, even when rebuking you. So often, if a student made a mistake, he would start to laugh and make jokes about the mistake to try to put everyone at ease. But everything became very highly personalized with Bishop Nikolai. All of the students at the time seemed to disappear during his classes. His tests were both oral and written, and were structured in such a way that he wouldn't ask very much of his students. He would ask only enough to check and see whether or not they had garnered the knowledge that he tried to impart unto them. Because he was already aged, and through the experiences that he went through, he would become nervous at times. And if a student couldn't find an answer, he would start tapping his fingers impatiently on the table, waiting for them to present their answers. Other times, Nikolai was known to sit during examinations, and while listening to the student's answer, he would draw icon sketches. And they were usually gospel illustrations, and then he would take them back with him to his room and fill them in with crayons. So regardless of what Nikolai was doing, he was always in a state of prayer in one way or another. However, this state of prayer was always accompanied with audible groans and sighs. Nikolai was a living textbook of all the courses that he taught. His teachings were curt and sound. Nikolai's greatest concern was the correct education of his students, and at all times in his teachings, as mentioned, truth had to prevail. This was Nikolai's policy from the very dawn of his scholarly career. In fact, when he was once introduced at the seminary in Sremski Karlovci in 1925, following the introduction during his spontaneous invocation, using his own form of poetic license, which I had mentioned, Nikolai said the following: "Take the truth, burn it, Pound the coal into ingots and bury it in the ground 3 feet under. Then lay down, go to sleep, and when you awake, the truth will have grown big, overwhelming, and overtaking all possible lies. Yesterday as today, Nikolai's treasures, both old and new, form the basis for all of his teachings. To begin comprehending Nikolai's teachings, or to attempt in any way to probe his theological thought pattern, it is first necessary to understand how Nikolai viewed theology. In answer to the question, what is theology? Nikolai would answer in the following. Theology means a word about God. Theology is therefore all or nothing. The whole of nature and the supernature and the subternature is all theology. All man and everything of him is theology. And so, to conclude my lecture for this evening, perhaps I can allow Nikolai to speak for himself and why he left the old world, came to this new world, and this is where he ended and spent his final years. I have come from the old to this new world. Which is the better, the old or the new? I could not know. But the revealer of all truths said to me and to you that a wise householder brings forth equally new and old things out of his treasury, not only the new, not only the old, but at the same time he revealed the new one. Our Lord Jesus Christ respects the Old Testament, but he revealed the new. Now we, his followers, are keeping both as one holy book. The highest wisdom consists in keeping both old and new treasures. The separation of the two brings about poverty, instability, and confusion. Thus I pray that in this, as mentioned, teleological presentation, I will have served to somehow fulfilled a quote which is cleft into the building of the National Archives of the United States of America in Washington, D.C., which states, "Past is prologue to the present," and I pray that this prologue, which comes from the past, will be an introduction to future lectures in this series on Bishop Nikolai. In fact, this is our own eschatological dimension of life eternal, already interwoven with life as we know it, in moments in which we encounter the divine and encounter each other. I had a rare experience, which I will share with you as a personal anecdote, that when I was writing my thesis here at St. Tikhon's Seminary, my mentor was Father Vladimir Borachevsky, and I'm very glad to see his portrait in numerous places throughout this building. And he was walking through my rough draft of the thesis with me, and at one point he simply looked at me and he said, "You write as though you knew Nikolai personally. When did you meet him?" "How could I have met him, Father? I was 1 year old when he died." He said, No, you've met him. When you go home for vacation, ask your mother, and you'll find out. So when I went home, I believe Thanksgiving break, I asked my mother, I said, "Did I ever meet Bishop Nikolai?" She smiled, laughed a bit, and said, "Yes, you did." I said, "But when? How?" She said, "I was carrying you," and she was in Chicago for an annual Serbian celebration of St. Vitus Day, where Nikolai went. He spent his summers in Chicago almost every year. And my mother took her blessing from Nikolai while carrying me. As someone who used to teach pedagogy, both here in the United States of America and Serbia, I like to think of intuition as the necessary basis for all knowledge. One goes from the intuitive to the cognitive, and that's how we not only learn about God, but how we come into contact with God. Not simply know about Him, but come to know God. That is what the life of a God seeker is all about. And this indelible touch is something which I have actually learned from Father Alexander Schmemann. It was one of his many theologumena, where he said that each and every human encounter, regardless of its brevity or how long that encounter may be, leaves its indelible mark on your soul, and you take that indelible mark with you into eternity, the kingdom of heaven. And I mentioned two works which came from Nicolai's final years, that golden era of his literary works. And the one was The Mystery of Touch, which is precisely how I encountered Nicolai, through this great mystery of touch. And then finally, Nicolai's own mystery of touch was fulfilled, because the last book which I mentioned that he wrote but never finished, The Only Lover of Mankind, was his transition to a very personal encounter with Christ, who is the only lover of humankind. And that book, which remained unfinished, I believe deep in my heart and in my soul, is still being written here, where he taught, and throughout the world by anyone who reads the works of Nicolai and comes to know this great and remarkable contemporary saint of our Holy Orthodox Church. Thank you very kindly for listening, and may God bless you through the prayers of our great saint, Nicolai Velimirovich. Amen.
Your Grace, if I may, I would like to respond for just a moment to your words from the podium, and we can
Please.
sing and then take some time with the students if we could.
Please.
May I trade places with you?
Indeed.
Your Grace, Bishop Irenae, thank you very much for this rich evening. I hope I speak from everyone. I rarely turned around to look, but I sat captivated on my chair. In fact, when you were delivering your beautiful words, especially the account about him teaching about the falling rain on that day, I was in the classroom, in the music room, looking out the window, listening to that beautiful teaching, imagining what that would be like here today, but not needing to, because you brought him with you this evening, and I thank you for that. I would like to take one brief moment, Your Grace, before we conclude our live stream by singing It Is Truly Meet, to once again thank the Elsie Skvir Ganister Foundation, which has made our live stream possible this evening, and also our partnership with Ancient Faith Radio, Ancient Faith Ministries, whose channel we are also live streaming this evening. It's a wonderful thing that we have, as I showed you, Your Grace, just around the corner, a beautiful Ancient Faith studio, from which, like this evening, we are trying to share the treasures of St. Tikhon's with the world. So thank you, Ancient Faith, and I'm glad we could share this evening with everyone as well. Could we please stand together? We'll sing It Is Truly Meet and conclude our live stream, and then have a chance for the students and those present to have some interaction with His Grace concerning the beautiful words of St. Nicolai.